Hey everybody, DJ here. Welcome back to DJ Tutorials, and this is going to be another video on Blender Basics. We are going to be looking at manipulating and adding objects into the scene. If you haven't yet, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out, and we also have a Discord server that you can join if you have any questions, and there is also a Patreon where you can become a member and get access to things like downloads and other things like that. Feel free to click on the links below in the video description. So let's go ahead and jump into Blender. You can see that I'm just opening up a fresh scene here. And for those of you who are newer, down in the bottom left, you're going to see a keyboard, which will show all the key commands. And I'm also going to have some key presses that you'll be able to see on the screen here. But just in case that goes out, you have this down here that you can use. So let's just click off to the side here, and this is going to be our default scene. And hopefully you went through the last video that showed you how to navigate within the interface, so you can kind of use whichever way you'd like to be navigating throughout the rest of this course series, depending on what you're trying to do. And so basically what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about how to actually move objects, translate, rotate, scale, all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be deleting and adding some objects into the scene here. So what we're going to do first, make sure that up here on the top left you have the select box here, and we're just going to left click and drag both of these items, and you can right click and then go down here to delete or hit X and delete those two objects, because really we're just going to look at this default cube here, and we're going to move this thing around and do all kinds of things. So before we really start doing this, I'm going to split the panel here, the viewport here, into quadrants. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the sort of like a 3D view here, and then I'm going to have a top view, a side view, and a front view, so that you can kind of wrap your head around how things are, moving in three-dimensional space here. And since this is for like complete beginners and people who are not used to this type of thing, you may want to follow this, or you may just want to watch, or do this on your own so that you can check this out. But I really think that it's important to really show you exactly what's going on so that it makes a little bit of sense here. So what I'm going to do here is at the top right, you're going to see this little cursor on the side. You can left click and drag this across to make multiple panels. And I'm going to hide the tools here with N and T in both of these windows. And it's important to know that when the cursor moves between these panels, you can see that I'm hitting T here. And then over here, if I hit T, the tool panel comes up. So I'm going to hit T over here. And then I'm just going to drop this down here and also drop this down here. So we have basically four ways of looking at the same thing. And in each of these panels, if I move them around, I can get different views. So on the top left, I'm going to kind of use this as just my regular sort of manipulation area. I'm going to move things around and show you some things over here. But here on this one, I'm going to use 1 for the front orthographic. And then down here, I'm going to go to the side. So I'm going to hit 3 for the right orthographic. And then down here, I'm going to hit 7 for the top. So we have top, right, and front, and then we have sort of a three-dimensional view over here that has a perspective. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to hit N, and I'm going to show you some things over here that's in the transform. But first, before we actually look at those, I'm going to hit T. I'm actually going to make this a little bit different. I'm going to move this over here. I'm going to move this down a little bit, just so I can have this a little bit bigger so you can see what's going on. So there are hotkeys that we're going to be learning, but I want you to kind of look over here first, and I'm going to explain how some things work in this tool panel. So over here on the left, we have this move one. And if we select an object with left click, you can see all these sort of things show up here. And basically, this is how you can translate an object using this tool. And if you left click and drag on these arrows, you can see that it's moving along this green axis, or the Y. And if you forget what they are over here, you can kind of see it's all color coded. So green is Y. So if I left click and drag, you can see that it's moving around in the three-dimensional view here. And then over here on the top view, you can see that it's moving along the green axis. And then on the right, you can see that it's moving along the green. But here, it looks like it's not being moved at all. And that's because when you're looking at it in the front, the Y is basically front and back. So it makes sense that you wouldn't see it move on this axis. And that's why when you look at it over here in this view, you can see a blue arrow and a red arrow. but you don't see a green arrow. And that's because you're looking dead on and you can't see it. And the same thing for each of these. Here we don't see the green one because we're looking right at it. And then this one right here, we don't see the x-axis because we're looking right at the x-axis and we can't see it. And the same thing here, we're at the top, and Z is up and down. As you can see here, if I left click and drag the Z, this window here, you don't see any movement because it's moving along the up and, whoops, the right click to reset it, up and down. It's going on this axis here, so you're not seeing anything move here. So these are all expected things to see here, but you kind of have to wrap your head around the fact that you're seeing things in 3 dimensions for this really to make sense. And for a lot of beginners, this is sort of, and a lot of teachers and trainers, they sort of skip this step of understanding 3 dimensional space. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to sort of wrap your head around this, but hopefully this will help you understand it, especially for the next thing I'm going to show you. Now, if you grab these right here, this sort of like plane that looks like a red plane, a green plane, and a blue one, and if let's say we left click and drag on this red one here, you can see that things are moving around in some dimensions, but there is one that it's kind of not moving around. Okay, so if we look at it from sort of a different perspective here, you can see that it's basically being locked to where it's moving along the blue and the green, and that's why you see those lines there. So the y-axis and the z-axis, it's moving along that, but you can see that it's not really moving along the x-axis. It's just sort of like moving along in 2 dimensional space. And you can see right here in this view, since this is the front, and left and right here, this is the x-axis. If I take this, if I left click and drag on this plane here, you can see that it's not moving left and right. And you can notice that in this view here and this view down here. So basically what this does is it moves it on every axis except the red, or X. Or another way of saying that is it's only moving along the Z and Y axes. So if you wanted only to move something up and down and front to back, you would want to left click and drag this one. And the same thing applies for all these other ones. So if I grab or left click and drag on the green one, you can see that it's not moving along the Y, and you can see that right down here. So if I left click and drag the green one, it's not moving along the Y, but it's moving along the Z and the X. And the same thing if I grab it on or left click and drag the blue, and I start moving it around, you can see that it's now moving along those two axes, but it's not moving up and down in 3 dimensional space. Now, if I left click and drag the middle, I'm now moving it along every axis depending on what view I'm in this particular view. So if I move it over here and I move it like this, I'm moving it along all 3 axes because I'm looking at the object from not a straight on view. Okay? So what that means is if I'm in a 3 dimensional perspective mode here, and I'm sort of looking at it like this, I can move it in all 3 dimensions. But if I were to grab it in, let's say, this top orthographic, I'm going to move this view a little bit so you can kind of see what's going on here. So let's do about here. And I'm actually going to turn off the overlays right here so you can sort of see what's going on. So if I left click and drag in this view down here and I move it, if I left click and drag the center of it, you can see that it's not moving on the z-axis. It's not moving up and down in this view here. I'm just going to show you that again. Okay, you can see that it's not moving up and down. And that's because I'm looking dead on from the top view. So it is not able to move in that z-axis. And the same thing applies here. If I left click and drag here, the only way it's going to move is along the X and the Z if I grab it right in the middle. And you can see that in this view right here, it's moving in those 2 dimensions, but it's not moving in the Y because I'm not seeing the Y axis here. And if I'm taking it in the right orthographic here, I take it and I move it here, you can see that it's now moving along the X and the Z, the Y and the Z, but no longer the X. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. And this is probably the best way I know how to explain what's happening here. And I'm just going to left click and drag these and move it back to its other position. And there is a hotkey to move it back, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I'm just going to move that right back to the center, or at least roughly, because you can see here it's sort of all over the place. So let's actually left click and I'm going to drag it and put it kind of roughly in the center of all these views here. So that's basically how you translate objects using this here. Now the rotation is pretty much the same. If I left click this icon here to make this into a rotation, it's kind of the same idea. But you can see that instead of arrows, I have these sort of like circles that go around it. So if I left click and drag the green, it's rotating around only the Y. If I left click and drag the red, it's only going around the X. And of course, if it's blue, I'm rotating it around the Z axis. And then if I grab this, the white here, it's going to rotate according to that view. And then if I left click and drag the very center of it, I can rotate it in all sorts of directions, depending on how I am moving the mouse around. So that's pretty simple and basic to understand. It's a very kind of basic, especially if you understand how the translation works. The rotation just basically works very similar to that. So let's go ahead and check out the scaling here. So let's left click that, and you can see it's basically the same idea. If I take it and I left click and drag on the green, it's scaling this object along. I'm going to right click to reset that. I'm going to left click and drag this out like this, and then the red here is the X, so I'm going to left click and drag that out. And the Z, I'm going to left click and drag that out. And you can see that everything's kind of getting scaled in a weird direction because our object has been rotated to a particular type of orientation here. And the scaling that's going on here is based on the global conditions. Now, there is a way to change that, but that's kind of going to be for a later um, tutorial where I talk a little bit more about how those things work. But just understand that how it's currently set, when you have these coordinates set in this particular way, when you're grabbing this, you can see that the line is going straight up and down. It's not according to how the object has been rotated. So just keep that in mind when you're doing these scales and rotations and all that. So scaling also has this way here of basically scaling on two axes instead of let's say all three or just one. You can do it on two axes. So basically by selecting that one, it does all the axes except the one that it's colored. So if I click and drag this here, it's doing it on X and Z, and then this is doing it on Z and Y, and then this blue one here is doing it on X and Y only. And then if you click and drag this part right here, which is basically inside this white section, it's basically scaling all three dimensions. And if at any point you find that everything is just a little bit too touchy, you can hold shift, which will slow down how quickly the objects are either being translated, scaled, or rotated. So that kind of helps. So I'm going to right click to reset that. So the transform tool right here, if we just left click and select that, you can see that from there you can rotate, translate, or move your object, and you can scale it in the different directions like this. Now, the thing to understand about doing all of this is that you're basically, when you rotate, translate, and scale an object, you're basically setting some parameters on that object that you may not be aware of. And if we hit N really quick, and it will bring open this panel here, and we click down the transform, you can see here that the location is now not 0. It's set to certain values. The rotation has some values, and the scaling has some values, and the dimensions have some values. So it's important to know that anytime you move an object or manipulate an object inside of Blender, it has these other parameters. And many times those parameters will make adjustments to other things, like if we add modifiers, or if you have particular types of materials that you've put on here that use textures based on the object information, whatever changes with this object will then change those other parameters as well. depending on whether or not they use that object data. So it's very important that when you're moving objects, rotating them, translating them and all that, that you at least understand that these are changing. Because if you find that when you, let's say, reset an object and it's changed all your modifiers or your materials or textures or something like that, it's very possible that you had set those according to a specific type of object uh, properties. Now, in order for us to get this object back to where it was, its original conditions, you can type in here zeros. So for rotation, I'm going to type in a 0. And for Y here, and then for Z here, I'm just going to put zeros in there. So now the object has been placed back to its original rotation, and it is no longer rotated in those weird ways. I'm going to go ahead and click the select box here just so that this is a little bit more clear what's going on here. And I'm actually going to collapse these panels because I think we're done with understanding how the different axes work here. So I'm going to left click and drag these up. And then this here, I'm going to left click and drag that down. And then here, left click and drag that over to the right. So now we have this large panel here so it's easy to see everything. So you can see over here the rotation's now been zeroed out, but the location is kind of messed up. I want to put this back to 0. So all we really need to do is just go in here, type a 0, and I can actually hit tab here and put zeros and then hit enter to enter that data in there. For the scale, you don't want to put 0 because if you put 0, it will flatten everything out. So the scaling should be a 1 and a 1 and a 1 for all those dimensions, and now we have our default cube back to where it was. The dimensions here are basically just saying how big this is according to the space, and we're really not going to get into the world properties right now to change how this is interpreted. Just know that the dimensions here, you can use these to actually create real world units of meters, feet, inches, all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to ignore this right now. Now let's talk about some hotkeys to make this a little bit easier. So if I hit grab, or G for grab, it actually moves the object in any of those dimensions. And you can actually move it around according to the orientation that you're in. I'm going to right click to reset that and hit 3 to go to the right orthographic view. So if we wanted to grab this and move this along the Z and the Y, we can do that in this location here by hitting G and just moving this around. And at this point, I'm actually going to turn on the screencast keys so you'll be able to see in the bottom left what I'm doing. So if I hit G and move that around, you can see that I can now move that in those two axes. And I'm going to right click to reset that. If I hit 7, I'm at the top view now, and I can hit G to move that around as well. And then from the front view, I can move that with G and just moving it around here, and right click to reset that. And the same thing applies for rotation. If I hit R, I can rotate this in that orientation. If I'm in a three-dimensional view, I can hit R and it will rotate it according to what the camera or the viewer here is sort of oriented towards that object. And so G and R will move those according to this dimension here. Now, let's say you wanted to lock these on particular axes. It's very simple. And I showed you this just so you can get a visual of what's going on with these tools over here, but really the best way to do this is with the hotkeys. So if I wanted to move this along the X axis, I would hit G and then X. And you see that now the red has been highlighted and I'm moving this along the X axis. I'm going to right click there and then hit G and Y, and that will move along the Y axis. And then if I wanted to move it along the Z, G and Z will move it up and down on the Z axes. Same thing with rotation. Rotate R, Y, rotates it around the Y. R, X, rotates it around the X. And R, Z, rotates it around the Z. Now, how do I get it to where it will do everything but a particular orientation? So if I wanted to rotate this, let's say on the Y and the Z, I would hit R, and then I would actually hit Shift. I don't remember what I said there, but if I wanted to rotate this around everything but the Z-axis, I would hit Shift Z. And you can see there that both Y and X have now been highlighted, and the rotation is now around those two axes. Then if I hit G, Shift Y, it's going to rotate actually I hit G Shift Y will grab it and move it around those two axes. So you can see it's moving on Z up and down and also along the X, but it's not moving on Y. And if I did the same thing here, G Shift Y, I'm moving it along the X and the Y, but no longer the Z. So rotating it, hitting Shift X will then rotate it along those axes, etc. So basically, Shift, if you hit a hotkey to grab or rotate something, the Shift and then particular axes that you don't want it to move on will be how you can lock it along those particular axes and not use the other one. So, of course, scaling is the last one that we talked about. And if we hit S to scale it, you can see that now we are scaling this in the particular orientation that we're looking at. It's basically scaling the whole thing just up and down like that, or in and out like that. And then if you hit SX, you can scale it along the X. I'm gonna actually left click to set that. Scale Y, and then SZ to scale on Z. And there you can see we've done it on those different axes there. So now I'm going to basically just rotate and translate this in a particular place so that I can show you how to set everything back to where it was. So to set these parameters back, and if I hit uh, N to open this up over here and click on item, you can see I have all this stuff here. Now you could go in and hit and type in zeros for all these. You could totally do that if you want, but there's a quick way to set all of these according to or set it back to its position before it's been moved. And that is using the Alt button. So Alt S will change the scale. So you can see right there, if I hit Control Z to undo, look at the scale here. If I hit Alt S, it moves it back to 1. Alt R will move it back to 0. And so then, in order to move this back to the center, we'll hit Alt G. And you can remember that because G is for grab. So if you grab this and move it over here, you can hit Alt G to move it back to 0. So next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell you how you can rotate or translate an object according to some specific numerical values that you may know. So let's say you wanted to take this cube here and you wanted to rotate it on the z-axis exactly 45 degrees. Now you could go over here and click and drag this or type in the information here. That totally works just fine. But I'm going to hit Alt R here to reset the rotation. What you can also do is hit R and then the direction you want to rotate in. So let's say it's Z, and then type in 45 and then enter. And you can see right there the rotation has been set on 45 degrees on the Z. And if I wanted to rotate in the Y direction, 45 degrees, you can see that I just did that there. You can see that it changed the rotation because when I rotated it in that other direction, it did it according to the global position, which then rotated all of these. So that can be a little confusing, but just trust me that basically when you want to rotate an object on a specific orientation, so R, Y, and then you want to do, let's say, 45 degrees again, you can see there that the rotation was set to 45. Alt R to reset, and the same thing goes with translating. So let's say you wanted to translate this, G to grab it and move it, X, and let's say it's 10 units. So there's 10 units right there. You can see that it just moved. So if you know, or let's say you want to scale this, so scale 1.5 to make it 50% larger, you can hit S 1.5 and hit enter, and there you have it has been scaled up 1.5 times. Okay? Alt G to reset the location, and Alt S to reset the scale. So next thing we're going to do here is we're just going to add a couple objects into the scene. So this is very easy, and all you really have to do is either go up here, left click, and select one of these meshes here, or you can hit Shift A, which is the hotkey, and we're going to basically create a little bit of a ground plane for everything to kind of rest on. So I'm going to click plane here. And I want this to be quite a bit larger because this needs to be kind of like the ground for everything to sort of be set on. So I'm going to hit S10 to set this to be a 10 times the actual scale or the original scale. And if I wanted to select an object here, I can select it from this window here, or I can select it from up here in the little tree, the object tree up here. So there's two different ways of selecting those objects. And you can see here, if I hit 1, and I come close here, I can't actually see the ground plane when I go to the orthographic view because it's a two-dimensional plane. But if you look at this x-axis, that's actually where the ground plane is set. And I want to move this just above that ground plane. So I can hit G and then Z and then move it up. Now, there is a way that you can actually lock this according to the grid in the background. And if you hold Control, you can see that it's now sort of clicking or snapping along with that background grid. So I'm going to move that right there so it's perfectly on the ground with that ground plane. Then I want to move this object so that it moves not in Z because I don't want it to go up and down. I want to just move it on the X and the Y axes. So think about it for a second and then come back to the video on how you can do that. So to do this, you just hit G and then Shift Z, and that will move it on both X and Y and not Z. So let's just move it over here to the back, and I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add let's go ahead and add a UV sphere. So there's our sphere. I'm going to hit 1. I'm going to move it on the Z, G, Z, hold Control so it snaps along the grid. And you can see that now that I'm zoomed out, it's no longer going according to these smaller grid lines. You see how it's snapping to the larger ones? So I'm going to right click and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more so you can see how this works with the smaller ones. G, Z, hold Control, and move it up, and you can see that it snaps along those other grid lines there. And now it's resting right on that plane. Then I'm going to hit G, Shift Z, move it over here, and I'm going to add one more object, Shift A, and I will add a cone. Left click that cone, hit 1, G to grab, Z to lock it on the Z axis, and hold Control to move it so that it snaps along the grid plane in the back. And now I have everything perfectly resting on the ground plane. Now, my challenge to you is going to be to go ahead and take these objects, rotate them, and scale them in different ways so that you can set up a nice little composition here on your ground plane, just so you can practice rotating, scaling, and moving around objects. So you can kind of play with those and practice moving those around, rotating them in different ways, scaling them up in weird ways, and of course, resetting those with Alt G, Alt R, and Alt S to reset those objects back and just play around with moving objects around in your scene. One of the most important things you can do in Blender is practice it just like a musical instrument, where you can get the muscle memory of knowing how to move these objects, rotate them around, and setting them back to their original position, because you're going to be doing that a lot in tutorials as well as in your own work. Make sure you subscribe so that you can see all the new videos as soon as they're released. And if you're interested, of course, become a patron so that you can have project downloads and be able to converse with me a lot more and help offset the cost of producing these videos. And I will see you next time on DJ Tutorials.